I do call this a kind of critical one. It's not correct. So coming towards the stove jack area, there's a ton of room in here. I mean, if you really wanted to remove Hey, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at a two-person hot tent coming from Pomoly. This is known as the Locomotive two-person. This is also available currently in a three-person model as well. So let's get right into it. All right guys, so having a look at some of the components outside of the bag with the Locomotive two-person tent. We do have a bag full of tent pegs and some additional guy lines. We also have a bag full of the tent poles. There are 3 inside of here. And then the tent fly and the tent body are actually included as one piece. They are detachable, but there's really no point unless you're going to be going fast and light, and I'll explain that later on in the video. I will also explain currently that this tent is not new. I have been using this for well over a year, probably about a year and a half now to be honest, and I've used it with or without a wood stove in the winter, the summer, the fall, and it has performed very, very well. So just keep that in mind. This is not new. There may be some blemishes, possibly some marks on the tent, but we'll have a good look at it instead. All right, so opening up the pole bag, as mentioned before, there are 3 poles with this. It is a hoop style tunnel tent. So the poles are actually color coded in this, going from the largest to the smallest. There is a graphite kind of color. There's a very bright silver and a black. I know it's probably not going to show up on camera, the difference in color, because it's very, very subtle. You can notice it by eye, but on camera it's a little bit difficult. So setting these poles up is very simple. Same as any other tent pole on the market, pretty much. You just click it together with a shock cord. And like I said, what I like to do is lay them all out because they are different lengths. So that'll be a black one there. This is a graphite one. And then we have the all aluminum colored one, which I believe is the shortest one. Well, we'll find out here in a moment. Click all of them together, and the tent is color coded. So when you do assemble, there are actual tabs identifying where each pole goes. So these are all lined up on that end, and coming down to this end, you guys can see that they are a little bit different in length, and that will be shown in the setup process. So those are the poles. Coming into the peg bag, there is a number of pegs inside of here, but as I mentioned earlier, this tent is not new. So I don't know if I'm actually missing any pegs or not. And there are a bunch of guy lines in here as well. I think I attached most of them, but here I have 2 additional ones. It looks like I didn't require them. So I'm not going to talk too much on the guy lines or the pegs. Obviously, it does come with the pegs and everything included. I will put up on the screen or mention in the specs a little later on what's included, how many pegs, how many guy lines, and that. But for now, we will do the setup process. The tent is very simple to set up. It is a non-freestanding tent, so you do need to stake out the front, the back, and basically stretch it out in a long tunnel configuration. And that's probably the only one thing that I'll mention is if you are going to be using this tent, you do need very solid ground to pitch it because it's non-freestanding. It's semi-freestanding, but technically non-freestanding. So if you can't get one peg in the ground, it can be a little bit troublesome for your camping experience. So you want to make sure you can get all the pegs in the ground. So let's get this thing set up. All right, so the assembly to this is very simple. Like I mentioned, these are color coded. How you find the color coding on the tent body is actually the strings down on the metal tabs where they click in. So here in the front, we have a white string. So that would be the aluminum, natural aluminum color. Down here, we have a black string. That is the black. And then at the very back of the tent, we have kind of a grayish string, which is more of the graphite color. So we're just going to simply take the poles, slide them in through the sleeves. We're not going to connect it to anything just yet. We're just going to pass them through the sleeves. And then once we get all 3 of these passed in through, we're going to stake out the foot end of the tent and then drag out the front of the tent and get that nice and tight. All right, and so now that I've got all 3 poles in the corresponding sleeves with their color, I'm going to take 2 pegs and come down at the foot end of the tent. And there are adjusters on this, making this setup of the tent very easy. So basically, it's going to put 1 peg in that side, 1 peg in this side, and I'm going to spread these 2 pegs away from each other and back to where I want the tent positioned. So I'm going to say right about there. And we're not going to be totally exact with it just yet because we have to drag out the front of the tent, which I'll do right now. So coming over towards the front of the tent, what I like to do with these is put these in very relaxed. There are two guyouts here. There's one string that has an aluminum stay inside of it, and then there's just the fly sheet. We're gonna go to this V cord and use that as our stakeout point. So like I said, I'm just gonna do this more relaxed and not crazy tight right now because the poles are not in. If you do put the poles in first, it can be a little simplified, but it's not going to be easy in high wind situations. So, and what I mean by put the poles in is locking them into the metal tabs down here. I often set my tent up in windy open landscapes. So that's the reason why I'm doing it this way, to help some of you guys out if you're battling some wind. Your tent won't go flying off if the poles are relaxed. So now we're gonna click them into the aluminum holders, and I'll show you guys what these look like with more close detail once I actually get this in here. I'm gonna start down here at the foot end, simply pushing in towards, clicking one in, coming over to the center. This will be the longest pole right here for most headroom. And then doing the front area, which you guys can probably see the stove jack already. It is in the open position. The last time I used this tent was in winter. And once we get to that point, then we can stretch the tent forwards and actually get it to shape. All right, so now that we've got the poles in, I could take these two front pegs out and lift the tent, give it a snug pull, put the pegs in where they look pretty accurate. And then we can start cinching in these tabs here to really give the tent its full shape. As you guys can see, that is nice and tight there. That's nice and tight there. We can rearrange this back peg, get it on its proper angle. That in there. So like I said, non-freestanding tent. It does require a little bit more time to set up, and terrain will dictate where you can set this tent up. But ultimately, if you're creative by using rocks, logs, tree roots, and things of that nature, you can get it set up in various places. So there are guy lines that I did pre-attach to this, 2 on the rear, 2 on the front. And the reason why I did that is because it is a non-freestanding tent. It is a tunnel tent. So when you get a snow load, it can weigh down on here if you do not guy the tent out. So these guy lines don't go off to the side. They actually go towards the rear on a 45. Which will give it that effect right there, pulling that really nice and tight from the rear, and then pulling 2 to the front to give that pull. So basically you end up with a really nice tight pitched tent. Okay, so now that I've got the tent set up with the, what I like to call the minimum amount of tent pegs, meaning the front guy out lines are pegged, the front body's pegged, the rear guy outs and the rear peg out points are pegged. There is one other peg out point that I really highly suggest doing. It'll keep this fly open and not pushing in on the side of the tent. I do call this a kind of critical one. It's not critical to the structure, but it will be critical to your enjoyment of camping. It also creates a nice little air gap inside of the fly and the mesh inner to get air in there to reduce on a ton of condensation if you're using this in the rain or a very humid or damp environment. So now that we've got that staked out, I will unzip one side of the door. There are 2 doors on this tent. We'll unzip one side, give you guys a look through, undo the other door, have a look at the exterior, and then we'll move inside of the tent. All right, so coming over to the left side of the tent, and I know half the tent right now is in the sun and the other half is in the shade, so it's gonna make it a little difficult right now. I will do a walk around the tent so you guys can very clearly see everything. Just battling with the sun today. So coming over to the left side, there is 2 zippers and 2 Velcro tabs on this door. Or 3 Velcro, sorry. We'll unzip that. You can leave this door pitched open if you secure it back using additional guy lines, which is really nice if you want to have a partially undone door. I would never recommend leaving it like this if you're using a wood stove, because this will flap and touch the wood stove if you have one in place. So just keep that in mind. If you're going to be using this, tie it back with an additional guy line. If you want the whole door open, we can just simply do the same to the other side. And if you have both doors open, I will also mention that there are little pieces of cordage on here. If you wish, or if you have trekking poles, you can actually pitch this door open as an awning, like that, with a couple pieces of wood or trekking poles or whatever you like to use, creating a little bit of an awning if it's windy or rainy or snowy and you want to have that outside view. If not, you can roll it up and pin it back, which I always recommend, especially if you're using a wood stove. Never leave your door material to flap in the wind, because eventually it will get flapped inside and hit the wood stove. And that goes for pretty much any hot tent. Always make sure your tent is secure. So here you guys can see one door open. There is a ton of room inside of this tent vestibule. This is an excellent tent for out of winter season, meaning no wood stove. Keep in mind, you don't have to bring the wood stove in winter. You can cold camp in winter. But what I'm trying to touch on here is the vast amount of vestibule area. Sitting in here, you could sleep in the vestibule area and not even go inside of the inner tent. The inner tent is a white mesh color. Same material as the outside, but it's a white mesh. Very, very nice light transmission in here, so it's not too dark, it's not too bright. The inner is removable, which I will touch on once we move inside of the tent. But sitting right here, you guys can see there is a ton of room. I'll go to the other side, unzip the other door, give you guys a look through the tent, and then we'll touch on some of the features in front of the tent that's in the really bright sunlight. And then we'll move to the back of the tent in the shade and touch on some of those features. So unzipping the opposite side door, like I said, just make sure the material is tight in your hand if you have a wood stove. The benefit of this is cross breeze. So if you're inside your tent and you've got the wood stove rocking, and even if it is raining outside, you can sit inside of the inner tent and have your feet towards the wood stove and either work with the wood stove and cook on the stove, or do whatever you're doing, lacing up your boots or getting dressed and ready for the day, or maybe just relaxing inside of the tent. You will have a massive amount of a cross breeze in here to help mitigate the heat and the temperature in the tent, but also to enjoy the outdoors, because you do have a very, very good view from inside of this tent sitting down looking out both the doors. Now, while I'm up front of the tent, I will also mention there are guy out points here on the tent. I do not put the guy lines on this. The reason for that is I run my tent very, very, very tight. These are here for basically additional support. So if you have a wood stove inside of here and you get a really heavy snow load, it can press in, pushing towards the wood stove. These additional guy out points will pull it really tight to basically eliminate that from happening. So if you do have any worry about that, I highly recommend guying out from here, here, and here. Touching on the front of the tent, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there are these aluminum stays inside of the tent. That gives a nice vertical wall on here, giving you more headroom for the wood stove. This is a little rain flap that blocks the vent from the inside. Currently the vent is closed. You can go inside and open up the vent. And that again will let more air circulate in and out of the tent for when you have the side doors shut. But if we undo this, we can actually get a good look at that mesh panel in there. Like I said, there is a solid panel closed behind it right now. You can totally roll this up and get it out of the way if you wish. I always leave it down just for the simple fact that it adds a lot more rigidity to the tent. And realistically, the wind blows in and underneath and goes in the vent, giving you loads of ventilation while it's set up. But the option there to remove it, or at least open it, is there. There are adjusters on every single corner of this tent. So when the fabric relaxes, if you're out in a rain and the fabric gets wet and it starts to get a little bit saggy, you can tension in the guy lines, you can tension in the corners on the fly, on the ground. Everywhere there's guy out tensioners on this, so you can really cinch in this tent very tight, which is really essential for a non-freestanding tent. All right, so coming towards the stove jack area, as you guys will notice, there's already a hole cut. When you get this tent, the stove jack will be sealed, no cut. I put mine in there in an X formation because typically I run 2 to 2.5 inch pipes. So that fits my pipe there. You guys can see it is open right now. If you do need a replacement stove jack, what I would recommend is cutting along the Velcro and then simply Velcroing your new jack in place. That's the reason for the Velcro here, so you can replace the jack if needed. So this is held up with these toggles, much like tent doors. If you're not in need of the stove jack, you simply zip it shut. You can prop a stick in here if you do have the stove jack hole propped in there for more ventilation. The zippers are weather sealed with this rubberized material, so they are kind of weather resistant zippers, not allowing any water to get in there when you're not using it as a hot tent. All right guys, so working our way towards the rear of the tent, I want to talk about this kickstand vent, which is very important for this tent because if you don't have this open, it can create condensation It's also a nice way to let fresh air in and kind of some of that hot air out of the tent. It is open right now. It does have a kind of a piece of foam in here to give it some shape that's actually permanently sewed in there. There are aluminum stays here with Velcro to simply close it if you really need to close it. And the only time I would say if you really need to close it is if you're actually getting wind and rain coming up in and it's pushing in. This will close it enough to prevent most of the rain from getting in there on really, really hard winds. I've never had that issue personally, but I imagine it could be a possibility. I like to leave it open just like that, ventilation in, keeps it nice. Also, it works as a little bit of a window when you're inside. You can actually see outside the back of the tent, which is a bonus. So back here, you can see the fly goes right to the ground. There are tensioners in the corners, as mentioned before, so you can really tension the tent nice and tight. Right now, we've got the guy lines going out on 45-degree angle to either side, giving this tent a lot of pull and a lot of rigidity. All right, so coming inside of the tent vestibule, I want to talk about the inside of this vent before I forget about it. Like I said, the wood stove would be placed here. The stove jack is directly above my head. And like I was saying, guys, there's a ton of room in here. I mean, if you really wanted to remove the inner tent or even, you know, put a dog out here or an additional person, there's a ton of room. Boomer usually sleeps inside the tent with me, my dog, but he has laid out here into the evening right next to the wood stove in the winter. So there's a load of room in here for cooking, firewood storage, putting your backpack, putting your shoes, your wet clothing, all kinds of room in here. So it really doesn't feel like you're stuck in here in a snowstorm or a rainstorm. Plenty of room. But talking about this vent up here, simply unvelcro it, roll it up, and toggle it open. This will allow a ton of ventilation to come in. And realistically, I pretty much always leave this open. And the reason I mention that is because the inner tent actually has a solid panel. So even if wind is blowing in through here during the night, the inner tent has a solid panel to actually block out because it is a 4-season inner. So that's nice to have open just for all the ventilation in here to cut down on a lot of condensation. There are straps built into this tent as well, so you cannot spread the tent too wide or too long. These retaining straps need to be tight. So keep that in mind. I like to put rocks on top of this if my wood stove is really low to the ground. That way the heat doesn't cause any damage to that. And like I said, I've been using this tent for over a year. I've had zero issues with it. It performs and works very, very well. So let's spin the camera around and give you guys an interior look at the inside of the tent. All right, so doing a real quick spin around inside the inner tent. Position myself here on purpose because I want to show you, you can actually sit up straight back. My head is kind of in the top, but I'm not towards the highest point. The highest point is actually right here. I've got a lot of room, so I will unclick this front portion of the inner tent and drop it in a few moments. But first, I want to show you the interior of this tent. Very, very nice and roomy. Like I said, wood stove would be positioned way up there, so you have more than enough room to come in and out of the tent without bumping into the wood stove. It's close enough that you can feed the wood stove from laying inside of the inner. Even sitting right here, I can reach out, open the door, throw some wood in, and do my thing there. Keep all my gear behind the wood stove, nice and dry. There's all kinds of hanging points up here on the inner to hang wet shoes, wet shirts, jackets, all kinds of things to get them dry in the winter season with the wood stove. So mentioning earlier that the inner does have a mesh panel as well as a solid panel. Two-way zip, you can zip it all the way shut. You can unzip it halfway, whatever your preferences are or needs. And I like rolling this inside. There are toggles to roll it up, but I just like tucking it inside under my sleeping mattress or underneath of the entire tent itself, just to keep it out of the way, which is what I'll do right now. There is like I said, there's no hook in the front, but there is a lot of hanging options here. So I hang my lantern on the front. There is a hook, however, way down at the foot end of the tent if you want to hang a lantern. There's a pocket up on both sides, very large pockets. I could probably fit one shoe in each pocket, to be honest. They're quite large. Down at the bottom of the inner, there is a large mesh panel that corresponds with that kickstand vent. And all in all, there is a lot of room inside of here. You can fit 2 sleeping pads in here very comfortably. I personally find this a very suitable one-person tent, especially in the wintertime when you have extra gear, jackets. I go camping with my dog, so I like having a little bit of extra room for him. And just moving around certain tools, I like putting my axe and saw kind of tucked inside where it's not going to get wet or damp or ruined. So this tent offers a ton of storage and a ton of livability. Now that we've explored that a tiny bit, I will show you that the inner tent is 100% removable. I'm not going to remove the entire thing today, but I will say you can remove the inner tent and choose to leave it home or choose to drop it down maybe during the daytime if you need some more working space. You can sit on top of it. But by removing the inner tent, like I said, the entire thing's totally removable. You can still peg out the tent. It is attached by these little buckles down here. So you can remove the entire thing off the tent and you don't need it. You can just rock basically the external tent. You can bring that with you, just a shell. Sleep on the ground with a ground mat. There is an additional ground sheet with this that has a ground sheet up to where the stove is, and then the stove turns into a fireproof mat. So you can get an additional footprint for this. I personally just put my pad right on top of the snow, sleeping bag, go to sleep when I'm not using the inner. But it is 100% removable, making this a very light setup. And we'll talk more about the specs in just a minute. Okay guys, so now that we had a really decent look at both the outside, the inside of the tent, some of the features that are pretty awesome to be a 4-season tent and be used with or without the inner, with or without a wood stove, and in many various weather conditions. Very high performing tent. We'll touch on some of the specs. So I've got the website pulled up on my phone right now, and I'm just going to burn through some of these specs really quick. So the capacity of this tent is a 1 to 2 person. As I mentioned before, there is a 3-person also available. There is no snow skirt, so that is important because, like I said, there's a lot of ventilation on the bottom side of this tent. There is no snow skirt to promote a lot of ventilation inside of this tent. And to be honest, the inner is a 4-season inner. The use of a snow skirt, in my opinion, is not needed in this tent, so I'm glad they actually left it out. Number of doors, 2 doors, obviously. The outer tent fabric is a 20D ripstop sil nylon PU of 3,000 millimeters. The waterproofing treatment is seam taping. Rolling down to the inner tent fabric is a 20 denier and a 40 denier ripstop nylon PU of 3,000 millimeters again. The tent poles are 7001 aluminum alloy, 8.5 millimeters in diameter, which is pretty standard. The total weight of this tent, including everything, is 6.2 pounds, also known as 2.8 kilograms. The color is dark brown and black. It's more of a coyote tan and a black. The tent weight is 6.2 pounds, again, 2.8 kilograms of the entire tent. The ground sheet weight is 2.2 pounds. So just coming through some of the specs here, the ground sheet is I think what they're referring to there is the fireproof mat, because that is a heavier material if you do want to use the ground sheet mat. Rolling into the sizes. So the highest point of this tent, being up here in the head end, is coming in at 3.44 feet or 105 centimeters. The total length of the tent is what is looking to be, or the sleeping compartment, sorry, the sleeping compartment is 7.22 feet, 220 centimeters, and the width of the sleeping compartment at its widest is 4.27 feet, 130 centimeters. The width of the stove jack area of the tent, so the widest portion, basically where the camera is looking towards me, the widest portion there is 4.92 feet, 150 centimeters. So that should give you guys enough specs. And like I said, I'll put the website down in the video description. There's all kinds of images on their website, all kinds of great products on there as well with more detailed specs. I just wanted to touch on some of the generic specs that people are going to ask. My opinion, using this tent after over a year and a half, I love it. The 2-door system works really, really well. The ventilation down on the foot end and in the back of those kickstand vents is super. The removable inner tent offers both a lighter pack weight and a faster setup and less things to carry. So you can come in and out of the tent with your boots on, not worry about ruining the floor, which is always nice. So So to be able to remove this, and for the simple sake of just drying it out, when you get home, sometimes it's nice to dismantle your tent and dry it out. For those of you who live in apartments, maybe live in a city where you just don't have room in your home. I know that's a common question that's asked, is how do you dry out your gear? Being a freestanding tent, it's easy. This is a non-freestanding tent. So to set this up inside your home may be difficult, because I don't know too many people that are ramming tent pegs through their ceramic tile, but it's a little difficult to set the tent up in the winter time. You can't put it outside because it'll freeze. So it's nice to have these removable for many options. But my opinion on the tent, 2 thumbs up on this. This is the Pomoly Locomotive 2-person. If you have any comments or questions, drop them down below. And I will mention the pack-up process of this tent is incredibly simple. Just drop all the pegs, drop the poles, pull it out. You don't even need to roll it. You just take the entire tent with the inner and the outer and cram it in the stuff sack. It takes about 2 minutes to break this entire tent down and pack it away. Super fast, on the trail and out of there. So peace out, guys. Catch you in the next video.